Hello and Hare Krishna. Welcome to today's episode of Chasing Reality podcast with me, Ryan, aka Ramananda Das. We're very fortunate we have yet another esteemed guest, Professor Garland Allen, who is a very well-known historian of science and specifically the history of biology. In fact, he was there in the earlyish 20th century for the inception of the field itself. So he knows all about this better than most, I imagine. I'm very excited because I've got some specific questions to ask him. He's written a number of articles and books, as you can imagine, including 2017 Scientific Process and Social Issues in Biology Education, which I think is a must-read for all of us biologists. So thank you very much for listening, and without further ado, let's get started. Okay, well, lovely to meet you, Gar. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate your time because I know that you've got so much experience in the history of biology. My understanding is that you actually were there at the beginning of the field's inception, and so I just like to ask you, how is it in general, having seen the progression of this field since its onset? There's not many people who could really say that in a field.
Well, that is correct. I mean, in a sense, the field of history of biology was beginning to form in the late 1950s and 1960s. The history of science was really dominated by history of the physical sciences up to that point, and a few discussions of things like Mendel and Darwin were encompassed under Victorian studies, really more than under a field that was known as history of biology. But in the 1960s, people like Everett Mendelssohn, John Green, and others began to really carve out a new field, if you will, which was really looking at the history of biology, both from the cultural and philosophical, but also from the detailed scientific perspective, and that is that it really did emphasize dealing with the science, with the understanding of the complexities of the scientific experiments or arguments, and so in that sense differed from the older Victorian studies, which were more focused on the cultural aspects. So it was the journal, The History of Biology, was formed in 1968, the first real journal associated with the field. The History of Science Society had published articles on the history of biology in its journal called ISIS, but that was a general journal for the history of science, not just biology. So the founding of this journal was really the opening aspect of the field of history of biology. And what's been interesting over the years has been the growth of the field. At first it was heavily dominated by what were called internalist studies, that is, studies that really looked at the details of the science in all their aspects, but was minimal in its discussion of social, economic context, and so on. And that, in some sense, was following the lead of the history of the physical sciences, which had been very technical up to that point. But as time went on, the history of biology got very much caught up in the issues of writing contextual history, the so-called science wars in the 1980s and 90s about whether science was really ever able to be completely separate from its culture and therefore, quote, objective, or whether it was always going to be composed of a subjective element that influenced the way ideas were formulated, hypotheses were devised, experiments or observations designed, and results interpreted. So that movement that really was very much emphasis on contextual set up a dichotomy between how much of history of biology should be focused on the scientific details, how much on the cultural context, or can they both be accomplished by some kind of a synthetic approach? And I think we're more at that point right now, rather than seeing this as an either-or way of interpreting the history. So that in my own work right now, I'm trying to write a history of genetics, incorporating both of those approaches. So not minimizing the scientific detail, but also trying to emphasize how genetics fit into a very rapidly changing economic and social context around the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. So I think we're in a more sophisticated place right now. The other interesting trend has been the relationship between the history of biology and the history of medicine and philosophy of science and philosophy of biology in particular. And in both of those areas, some strides have been made, but my own feeling is that we need to do a lot more to bring those perspectives, biomedicine and the true philosophy of biology, philosophy of science, but particularly philosophy of science applied to biology, into our work. So there's some very exciting stuff to do ahead, a lot of synthetic work that is, I think, going to be very interesting to watch over the next decade or so.
Thank you. For me, it's fascinating to hear about the history and also the philosophy of science in general, but specifically biology, because that's my background. When I was in the lab, I was motivated by certain things. I was very curious. I love the idea of trying to figure out what life is. Do you think that in terms of unification, you mentioned synthesizing, where does that come from? Does it come from a place of intention? So, for example, a unified intention, or is it something more than that? I'm just struggling to think how huge disparate fields can come together.
Well, I'm not sure I can give you a definitive answer on that. It is certainly not as conscious a program as it was, for example, in the 1950s when the Unity of Science movement came out of Vienna, and the Vienna Circle and all of that. And probably the culmination of that was Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolutions. So what's happening today is, I think, a little less self-conscious program building, but it is more arising out of the empirical necessity in some sense. You really can't write about the development of the chromosome theory in 1910 to 1930 without engaging with the philosophical issues that were actually being debated by the people doing the scientific work at the time, or by philosophers who were looking at the scientific work, such as Alfred North Whitehead, and trying to devise a sort of a unified, or at least a comprehensive picture of what biology is, or what it should be. So I think, at least I've found in my own experience, I lose something by ignoring these other approaches, including biomedicine. So that it's not. I personally like to synthesize and bring things together, but I think it's and that is a part of my scholarly program, I guess, if you wanted to call it that. That I do want to bring these various approaches to bear on a particular historical period or a particular historical development in biology. But it's certainly not a movement among scholars in general as it was in the 30s and 40s and 50s.
I see. Okay. And my understanding is you were saying it's mainly now coming not necessarily as a kind of active movement to synthesize things, but more as a necessity to be able to really understand.
Well, that I'm speaking from my own experience about that. I'm not sure that other people who are doing it, whether they feel the necessity or whether they actually have a more active programmatic goal in mind. But my own feeling is it certainly has enriched the work, and I think it's made it better to try to bring all of those perspectives to bear on the particular issues I'm trying to write about.
Okay, I'm looking forward to the. The upcoming piece of work. I imagine it's a large undertaking, but I can see why you're starting with genetics. It seems to be the linker of many different fields. So it's like the, what do you call it, the common denominator, perhaps, to some extent.
Correct, in many ways. I mean, genetics has, since 1900, has really become almost the centerpiece of biological theory, no matter whether you're talking about physiology or field biology or evolutionary theory, whatever. Certainly genetics has become central to almost every aspect of biology. And I mean, it's sort of an accident in a way. I did my thesis work in graduate school on Thomas Hunt Morgan, who did the initial work on using fruit flies to develop the chromosome theory. And I wrote a biography of Morgan, and I've been involved in the relationship between genetics and eugenics for many years. So in many ways, my really focus has been the history of genetics in all of its aspects for virtually my whole career. But there's also, as you point out, that over time, genetics has really become the central theoretical part that underlies almost every aspect of the life sciences today.
Yes, indeed. If it's okay, I'd just like to ask you a little bit about it. It's more my selfish interest, if that's okay. I did see you.
Okay.
You have
Okay.
you have produced some work on this, and perhaps maybe not as much as you have in other areas. But I'm very interested in the idea of what underlies the way we do research, what underpins it. So, for example, I know you've spoken about the materialist, the mechanist, and holistic or organicist, the two different
Right.
ways working a materialist framework,
Right.
and also kind of maybe what's often been conflated with holistic or organicist accounts, but is often maybe non-materialist, the vitalist way of thinking.
Right.
I'd just like to get your perspectives on those, because I think I've seen a big resurgence. So I'm not a historian like you, but I've noticed, the third wave evolution. There's a whole website with many process ontologists, it seems.
Right.
And I just like
Well, I can tell you a little bit about that. I'm not as well versed in all the philosophical comings and goings as a professional philosopher would be, and but these issues, the debates between the mechanistic biology and the holistic biology were very much to the front in the 1910s and 20s and 30s. And the period when classical genetics was maturing, and it was exemplified by the mechanistic side by people like Jacques Lerbe, and the holistic side by people like, including sort of Whitehead, but more biologically trained people such as Jacob von Uexküll, Joseph Henry Woodger, E.S. Russell. So a bunch of people who were trying to counter the sort of view that life is nothing more than chemical reactions, and that the organism is nothing more than a bag of enzymes. And that approach was, people like Lerbe stated it very explicitly in rather extreme terms, but so many people, including T.H. Morgan and his whole crew at Columbia, and many other geneticists, R.A. Emerson at Cornell, all sort of subscribed to a materialistic view that the organism was composed of material entities, and that there was nothing more special. There was no life force or vital energy, as was being claimed by some people that call themselves vitalists. And the mechanistic biologists were really trying to counter that approach, which said essentially that you can't ultimately you cannot distinguish, you cannot reduce living systems to just chemical and physical forces, that they have some special, they call it a vital fluid, a vital force, various terms. But that seemed to the mechanist rather defeatist, because it said essentially biologists will never be able to get to what it is that makes up a living system and just differentiates it from a non-living system. So that debate was very much to the fore among many people in the teens and 20s and 30s. And I think you're right, this so-called process ontology or processual ontology is a revival of that idea of the holistic view, but I think in a much more sophisticated way than their predecessors could do, way back 100 years ago. Partly because biology has so much more theoretical underpinnings now than it did then, and the molecular biology part has really been and computers and genomics and so on has really contributed to being able to do something more with that approach than simply talk about it. So I think the process ontology is really a revival of what was sometimes called holistic biology or organicist biology in the past, but is really trying to look at biological processes as wholes and very anti-reductionism. You can't understand an organism by studying 100 different enzyme catalyzed reactions separately from each other. You really have to, and genomics seems to be providing one way of approaching that by being able to analyze how different genomes function with relation to their particular genomic elements, and that different genes interact with each other in different ways, and the genetic background is extremely important, that there's no such thing as just a direct translation of a segment of DNA into a phenotype. And these kind of approaches are, I think, beginning to provide a very fruitful way to sort of understand life as basically a complex set of organizations, and that means processes. So just to identify a stretch of DNA as having some particular translational element into a protein or whatever is not going to tell you how that system functions in a living organism. So I'm very excited about this new approach, and partly because it undermines the whole approach that was gaining particular social significance in behavior genetics in the 90s and 80s and 90s about a gene for criminality or a gene for schizophrenia or whatever. And those particular approaches really had some dire social consequences if they were applied in that way in a clinical context. So I think there are many reasons why a more holistic organicist approach is really going to help push biology even more to the forefront among the sciences.
Thank you. I'm going to try and just say what I think I understood there, and please correct me if I thought
okay.
you were saying I thought you were saying that there have been these different approaches in history, the mechanist approach where the aim is to reduce everything to chemicals. So life is just a combination of chemicals, and if we break the TV apart, we can put it back together again and figure out what life is.
Right.
But I also saw that you're saying that there's this other approach, the organicist approach, which is much more holistic and treating things as systems almost, and that seems to be making a comeback in a more sophisticated way. And if I'm right, I think you were saying that it's actually, you feel like it would be more safer for society as well as maybe more productive in biology. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a very concise summary. Thank you for doing it so easily. But that is exactly what I was trying to say. It has only the new movement has not only good consequences for biology and biology research and biomedical research, but also for clinical and social policies as well.
Yes. Oh, the future sounds bright.
I'm sorry, what?
The future sounds bright.
Right. Yeah, it really does. I think we're moving in a positive direction.
Well, that brings me on to another question. We haven't really spoken about vitalism, and I know was it Watson or Crick? I'm not sure which of the two. They both took challenges. One was to figure out how development happens. The other one, from what I understood, was to put the final nail in the coffin in vitalism. Do you think that final nail has been plunged into the coffin, or could you see it at some point, not the right terminology, but emerging back, coming back?
Well, I mean, the term vitalism itself is loaded and has been used pejoratively on both sides of the debate from the 17th and 18th century onward. And what I think to give them their due, I think what the vitalists were trying to counteract was the Cartesian notion that the organism is just a machine. And that notion was very much promulgated not only by Descartes, but also by a number of biologists in the 18th century who really compared organisms to clocks. They built model organisms, that a duck that would drink water and mimic a lot of vital activities of a live organism, and they showed that they could do it with gears and levers and that sort of thing. And but people who really looked at especially the functional aspect of organisms just realized these machine analogies were so simplistic as to be of very, very limited value in thinking and trying to understand, organic processes. And so, but a number of those people, in reacting against that mechanical view, sort of went to the other extreme and said that, organisms have these vital forces and vital properties that we'll never be able to understand in mechanical terms. And so that we should, that the mechanical analogies are leading us astray. And the problem with that, as I mentioned earlier, is that essentially says the problem is beyond the reach of, what we can envision as any kind of scientific, explanation or research. As a result, the new generation of materialists of mechanistic biology were much more. They brought in chemistry more than just physical machine analogies, and they were trying to say there are ways you can get to understanding a vital process like respiration or like the way blood cells carry hemoglobin and that sort of thing, so that they were arguing that this vitalism is just defeatist and it's obscurantist, and they called it every name in the book they could think of that was derogatory. But then this middle group, the organicists or the holists, were trying to strike a middle ground, and the problem was they didn't have the tools, often laboratory tools, investigative tools, whatever, to put their holistic approach into practice. It was of limited value. The reductionist approach was much easier. You could always grind up a fruit fly in a Waring blender and separate out its proteins and find out what catalyzes what and so on. And that you can get some positive knowledge that way, even though from the holistic point of view, you're not really understanding the fruit fly as a fruit fly. So I think the the fact that over the course of 300 or so years, the reductionist analytical approach has produced a lot of results, whereas the holistic approach has produced, in many ways, minimal results other than providing a new philosophical perspective on the organism. But it has often been simply pushed aside as being possibly interesting, but not empirically productive.
Thank you very much. I'm wary of the time. I don't want to go too far over because I said half an hour. So I have one more question for you, which is
Sure.
I'm going out a little bit on this one, but I just thought, why not? I'll try. My perspective is that organisms, we have, so there's the body aspect, which maybe is better explained in terms of a system. That's true in terms of the way we analyze it. But the actual organism I experience in myself I experience a qualitative world. I don't see any reason to suppose some other organisms don't.
What's the word? I'm sorry.
I experience a qualitative world of, I'm conscious of not just self-conscious, but the fact that I experience, I'm an experiencer of the world. That seems like a very important aspect of biology, and I'm just wondering, in your long travels through the history of biology, this question of consciousness, is it something that is just, can we just call it an emergent property and be done with it, or is it something that's just outside of the realm of science? What are your perspectives on it?
Well, I am really not terribly qualified to answer that question other than just speculation. I mean, I think the word consciousness has been used to describe various states of different kinds of organisms for centuries. I mean, I think it even goes back to Aristotle. But the notion that what do we mean by consciousness is something both philosophers and psychologists and animal behaviorists have grappled with. I mean, I think there is such a thing as consciousness. I mean, depending upon what organism you're talking about, humans certainly have self-consciousness. That I don't think there's any debate about that. Whether a fox or a cat has self-consciousness is, I think, more questionable or debatable. They certainly are conscious, if by conscious we mean they are aware of things in their environment and respond to them.
Yes.
So, I mean, that I think it's a useful concept because the animal behaviorist people tell me that different animals have very different consciousnesses about the world and the environment around them. So I think it is useful, but it has to be kind of defined, I think, carefully in each context, what you mean by this or that act being a conscious act.
Yes, thank you for that point. I agree, the term consciousness is, it's got many different ways that it can be interpreted. I
Right.
got punched in the boxing ring and I'm unconscious. Or
Right.
Okay, thank you very much, Guy. I really appreciate your time.
Okay, Brian, good luck with the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I enjoyed talking with you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much for joining me for this very interesting discussion with Professor Garland Allen. I'd love to just talk to him all day, to be honest. You can see he's got such incredible knowledge and insights into the history of biology, and it's something that I really crave, actually. I feel like, truthfully, I feel like I was shortchanged, and maybe it's not, I can't blame anyone. But I went through many years of training as a biologist at university, and then through my PhD, and not once did it cross my mind that the history or preferably philosophy of biology would be important to consider. And now I can see that actually having that breadth of knowledge is so important in science because maybe we can't know everything, obviously, and there's only a limit to what we can know. We're specialists most of the time. However, I think it allows us to become better informed so that we can design experiments better, maybe not make so many mistakes, maybe come up with things that go beyond the normal. We get kind of stuck into the, at least I did in the lab, you get stuck in the rut of doing everything the way that everyone else does it. There's an experimental protocol that the lab just passes around. And just listening to Gar there just really got me thinking that, wow, there's such a big world out there. And really he was just mainly talking about the 20th century biology, where he spoke about the predominance of mechanism or mechanistic thought. Reductionism, sometimes it's maybe called. The idea that things can be reduced to a mechanism. So not things, but biology. So the idea that life is composed of parts, and if you just break it all up, you look at all the pieces, it is possible to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But actually there's a whole other school of thought called Organicism or Holism, which is pushing through now and has been around for many years, but it just hasn't been taken so seriously. But now we can see it is. I spoke to one biologist already who represents the growing emergence of perhaps we can say process ontologists, Professor Dennis Noble. You can check out that interview. And the idea being that organisms are complex systems, and you can't just pull things apart and expect to be able to understand the whole by looking at the parts. So in other words, the whole is more than the sum of the parts, is another way of saying it. This isn't to say that looking at the pieces isn't important and informative, but we have to have a bigger framework upon which to understand how those things fit together. And Gar seemed to be saying, from what I understood, that this isn't just important in terms of the progress of biology, but it's also important socially, politically, and maybe for medically. We're seeing a lot now in biology to do with the hollow genome, the idea that we've got just as many cells that are bacterial in origin on us as human cells. So kind of a 1-to-1 ratio, which kind of indicates what they're seeing is that these cells are very important, these bacteria. It's not like they're not just doing anything. They're often fulfilling very important functions for us. So therefore, what is an organism? What is an organism? There's a word, the holobiont. So instead of an organism, it's the holobiont, the idea that we're a combination of organisms, and that's what an organism is. Now, I asked Gar at the end the question of consciousness. My own perspective is that, yes, this body is a machine, and we can investigate it in many different ways, and there'll be different ways which are more suitable, perhaps the organicism or process ontology route of understanding organisms as systems. However, there is a point. Organisms, at least I, experience the world, and that's the main thing I care about. So my questions, it does remain. How do we deal with this question of consciousness? Is it something that biology can deal with? Or do we explain it as an emergent property, the fact that, I'm an experiencing person? Is it perhaps important in affecting biology? It's a very interesting question, and I'm not sure how we're going to deal with it. So I'm going to keep asking the question. For most researchers, it's not their specialist field, and that's okay. I'll ask, and hopefully at some point I'm going to get an answer from someone that's going to really lead to an interesting line of thought. And I hope I've got ideas. I've got ideas for experiments we can do in biology with consciousness. But I don't want to be called crazy. Do you know what I mean? So I need to talk to fellow scientists, philosophers, historians, and just see what kind of ideas are out there. Thank you very much for listening. And who have we got next time? It's a surprise. I'm not telling you. Rawr!